Hi, Steve.
Hi, Bob.
How are you?
I'm fine, thanks.
Good. Thanks for joining us. I should say that I am Bob Wright of Blogging Heads TV, and you are Steve Pinker, world-famous psychologist at Harvard. Is that what it says on your business card?
Yes. I'll have to change it to say that.
Yeah. It just says Harvard now?
That's right.
You could do a much better job of self-promotion. I've always thought you were deficient in that area, Steve. So thanks for sparing the time for us. We're going to talk a little today about some of your past work and about your work in progress. I wanted to start by telling you, I may have already told you this, where I think I first heard your name, which was in the early 1990s, and I was having coffee or something with Steve Coslin, who's now your colleague at Harvard. I think you were at MIT at the time?
That's right, yes.
And we were talking about psychology. I didn't know him well. And I was giving him a sermon on the virtues of a Darwinian worldview. He was explaining to me, kind of his view of the mind, and I was kind of saying, well, that's all fine, but I think you'd really make more progress and have a richer view if you kept asking what was this part of the mind designed for by natural selection and so on. And I was getting pretty evangelical, and at some point he just kind of looked at me, and I think not in altogether approving fashion, and said, "You remind me of Steve Pinker." And so I guess your identity already was established at that point. I don't know if your book, The Language Instinct, had come out yet.
Probably not. It came out in February '94.
Okay.
But I had written an article with Paul Bloom called Natural Language and Natural Selection, arguing that language can best be understood as a Darwinian adaptation for communication. That had already come out. And I've known Steve for many years. He was my graduate advisor, and then we were colleagues. He's now the Dean of Social Science at Harvard, and we remain good friends. So he certainly was familiar with my worldview.
Yeah. And so yeah, the language instinct, I think this was about the time the term evolutionary psychology started to be used. I don't know if you used it in that book, actually.
I did, in the final chapter.
Uh-huh. And first of all, what would you say, how do you size the state of play up in terms of the extent to which Darwinism has penetrated the psychology enterprise?
I think now most psychology textbooks have either a section on evolutionary psychology or bring evolution to bear on a lot of the topics. So I think that has been a change. I think that people don't reflexively say essentialism, determinism, reductionism, atomism, Nazism when they hear the word evolution anymore.
Right.
This is not to say that it does not remain controversial, which it does.
Yeah.
But I think I think it's gone from outrageous to controversial.
Right. I mean, back in the 90s, we were members of an insurgency.
Yes.
It was fun. We were happier then, Steve.
It's true.
Back when we
right.
had nothing.
Yeah, I guess that's right. But there are things to be said with actually sitting down and asking hypothetical questions that you can then test in experiments instead of hitting people over the head with arguments as to why it would be a good idea to do this.
Right. As the data mounts, your case does get stronger, I guess.
Yeah.
So your book, The Language Instinct, one thing I've always wanted to do is kind of ask you to compare and contrast it with Chomskyism. I mean, Chomsky was already famous for, I think, saying that in some sense a linguistic capacity, and more than a mere capacity, but to some extent linguistic structure was kind of built into us. Am I right?
That's right.
But I don't think he was at all Darwinian about it, and maybe I would think that the ideological space that he occupied then and occupies now would not at that point have been especially hospitable to using the word Darwin, but maybe I'm wrong. So how do you compare your take in The Language Instinct to the existing Chomskyan view?
Well, Chomsky was heretical in the late 50s for even suggesting that language had some biological basis as opposed to being just another set of acquired skills and habits. And occasionally in his writings in the 1960s, he mentioned that language would have obvious Darwinian advantages. But he I think he does distance himself from a Darwinian explanation as to why we have this biological capacity for language, and is far more comfortable with the idea that it's a necessary consequence of as yet to be discovered physical law, that when you pack a certain number of neurons into a skull, they can only arrange themselves in so many ways, and that for all we know, one of the ways might be to give us language. He's also suggested that there may have been more recently, there may have been a macro mutation that gave us the capacity for recursion. That is, a recursive routine is one that can call an instance of itself. More generally, recursion in the context of language means a phrase that can contain a phrase of the same kind, a sentence that can contain a sentence, as in, I think that he is a nice guy, where he is a nice guy is a sentence that's embedded inside I think that he is, etc. That once that ability popped into the brain as the result of this macro mutation, that the rest of language was an immediate consequence. That recently he suggested that our auditory system was borrowed from the generic primate plan. Our words come from generic primate concepts. This is an argument that he made with Tecumseh Fitch and Mark Hauser in a paper in Science. And so there's now a bit of evolution in the story, but it is still not a Darwinian account in the sense of invoking the advantages that language would bring in terms of cooperation or information sharing, and that would therefore select for a sequence of genetic variants that would gradually install the ability to communicate grammatically.
Well, and is it a kind of a spandrel-ish view that they were taking?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of kind of a macro mutation that gives you the recursive ability that Chomsky has suggested is at the core of syntax.
But then the ability to actually communicate is just a happy byproduct.
Exactly.
Which would, in Stephen Jay Gould's terminology, make it kind of like a spandrel and not an adaptation, and just a byproduct of something that was actually selected for by natural selection.
That's right, and that is his more recent view of language evolution, which not coincidentally came about with his most recent theory of syntax. Chomsky is famous for revising his theory every decade or so, and the most recent version, misleadingly I think called minimalism, generally has the flavor that syntax has one major computational operation where you merge two syntactic structures. One of them can go inside the other. It's kind of like recursion, and that's the basic machinery that you need.
Well, as long as you're using the term syntax, do you want to review for our slower students, which I'm afraid would include me in this case? You hear the term syntax and grammar.
Yes, right.
What is the distinction?
Yeah, syntax is the way that words are combined into phrases and sentences. Mm-hmm. Grammar sometimes is used to embrace both syntax and other combinatorial systems in language like morphology, which is how you build complex words out of simpler words and prefixes and suffixes. So dishwasher, for example, which is made out of dish and washer, and then washer is made out of wash and
Mm-hmm.
That's the component of language called morphology. And if you put syntax and morphology together, that is rules that build words and then rules that build phrases out of words, those together could be called grammar.
Yeah. Speaking of rules, can I tell you how bad American educational theory can get sometimes? This involves Chomsky in my 9th grade English class. Okay?
Go ahead. Proceed.
Chomsky was apparently all the rage when I was in 9th grade. And, he had this idea that I think that there's this, that what we hear is spoken language is what he called the surface structure, and that resulted from a transformation done on something called the deep structure by our brain. Is this ringing a bell?
Oh, yes. That was the theory in the 1960s.
Okay,
right.
So there was this kind of, the deep structure would be a much more abstract formulation of a sentence that would be kind of common to people everywhere, regardless of what language they spoke, right? Kind of.
Well, that's the additional hypothesis that deep structure is universal,
okay.
Which I think was popular for a year or two, but then it was abandoned because it just wasn't true.
Well, it wasn't abandoned in my 9th grade English class.
Okay.
But amazingly, some like pedagogical theorists decided that if this was a true account let's assume this is a true account of the way language is generated, they decided it would do us some good as students to be really conscious of the process of transformation. So we had this textbook whose fundamental approach to teaching grammar was to get us to memorize these like theorems by which you would translate deep structure into surface structure. It was complete Greek and gobbledygook. It did us no good whatsoever, and we spent a whole year doing it.
You're kidding. Well,
no.
I'm just a year or two older than you, and I had to endure the application of B.F. Skinner's theories of programmed learning. And so I went through these curricula where we would have a sentence, and then the same sentence would be presented without its final word, and we'd have to fill in the word. That is, you break down a skill into small responses that can be individually shaped and reinforced, and you would work your way up through a set of a ladder of colors.
Gosh.
And like many educational fads, it lasted a year or two, and you were the beneficiary of the 10-year echo of Chomsky's attack on Skinner. So I got Skinner, you got Chomsky, and who knows what they're getting.
And plus,
now.
I assume you got some food pellets in the course of the of that process, right?
Well, Skinner never explained why with humans colors. Well, actually, maybe he did explain through secondary reinforcement. But with humans, you don't have to use food pellets. You can use a ladder of colors. So you advance from brown to green to red to silver to gold and so on. Nowadays, I'm sure that the kids are all learning about neural networks and neuroplasticity, since given that the 10-year time lag between what goes on in the psychology departments and what gets translated into educational practice, that's probably what they're getting nowadays.
That's a story in itself. Somebody should, I don't know if there's been a good book on that problem in our educational system, but maybe I should write it. So then in your most recent book, you talk about language. I mean, you are a trained linguist as well as being a psychologist, I guess, right?
Well, I don't have a degree in linguistics. I did do a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Cognitive Science at MIT, and my main advisor, Joan Bresnan, was certainly a card-carrying linguist. Okay.
So in your it is your most recent book, right? The Stuff of Thought?
That's right.
And there you tell us what you conclude about the relationship between language and human nature, or how you use language in that book to look at human nature.
Yeah, in that book, I combined my two general interests. One of them is in the mechanics of language, and the other is in human nature. And I asked, what does language, both the meanings of words and the way that language is used in a social context, tell us about the different faculties of the human mind? What do nouns, verbs, prepositions, and tenses tell us about substance, causality, space, and time, respectively? I mean, or at least what does it tell us about the human way of conceptualizing space, time, substance, and causality? In another chapter, I asked, what does swearing tell us about human emotion? Taboo words, swear words, racial epithets, and other nasty words, or words that we perceive as nasty, evoke certain emotions. Why can an emotion be evoked by a sound, and why do we attribute these almost magical powers to words that make them so contentious in the legal sphere and the literary sphere and social sphere?
And is there a short answer to that question, what this tells us about the human emotional structure?
Basically, swear words evoke negative or highly charged emotions, and even though different languages have different linguistic taboos, in some languages it's religious, some it's sexual, some it's excretory, some it has to do with death and disease, but in all cases these are topics that rile us up emotionally. And a swear word basically is saying that I'm bringing up this topic in order that you and I both understand that we're talking about something really nasty or arousing or evocative.
Mm-hmm.
And that opens the door to lots of ways in which we can swear, whether to intimidate or abuse someone, or to establish a kind of informality, to say this is the kind of setting in which we don't have to watch what we say. There are a number of different social uses to which swearing can be put. But anyway, so I mentioned there's a chapter on what language tells us about the basic building blocks of thinking. There's that chapter tells us about what are the basic negative emotions that humans are prey to and how do we share them. Then I have another one on innuendo and euphemism and taboo and politeness and indirectness. Why we beat around the bush and shilly-shally and insinuate what we mean instead of just blurting it out. Why should there be such a psychological difference between saying something in so many words as opposed to using some kind of euphemism, given that any adult knows what the euphemism means anyway.
Right.
So the classic difference is why is, at the end of a date, if a man says, do you want to come up and see my etchings, where everyone knows what that means, why is that socially so much more comfortable than do you want to come up and have sex, given that the content is the same?
Well, what's the answer? This is important.
Yeah. I think part of the answer is, in some cases, is plausible deniability. That is...
I would opt for something other than the etchings line if he really wants plausible deniability, but anyway.
Exactly. Well, I think that actually raises an important point, because you're right. Once a euphemism is used so often that it's a cliche, there no longer is any plausible deniability.
Right.
But here's what there is. There's plausible deniability of what logicians call common knowledge, which I think is a critical distinction. The common knowledge is when two people not just agree on something, but each one knows that the other one knows that he knows that she knows that he knows that she knows that he knows it ad infinitum. And I think with a euphemism, there can be plausible deniability of common knowledge. That is, if Harry says to Sally, do you want to see my etchings, Sally knows that he's made a sexual overture. But she isn't as sure that he knows that she knows. She could retain a scintilla of doubt that he might think that she's naive, or that she might think that he's dense. We've done experiments to show this, that even if people are certain about what a proposition means, they're not so certain that the other guy knows that they know that the other guy knows. Even
if they know that the guy knows, they don't know that the guy knows that they know.
Exactly.
But that would be so insulting to Sally that surely she wouldn't have sex with him if there was truly... If she thought so little of her.
Yeah.
So,
well, what it does is it allows... I think the reason that common knowledge is so critical is that it's the basis on which we change or maintain a certain kind of relationship. So if what's crucial with Harry and Sally is that if they don't end up as sexual partners, they stay colleagues or friends or co-workers or whatever other relationship they have, then the plausible deniability of the common knowledge allows them to maintain the fiction of the friendship in a way that if each one was forced to acknowledge that the other one knew that they knew that the other one knew, then the fiction would no longer be sustainable on the assumption that both of them are rational.
You know, I just had a blinding and uncomfortable revelation about myself, Steve. And it's that I am just as uncomfortable using the common knowledge euphemisms as I would be saying the thing explicitly.
Well, you could probably then back up and make it even more indirect. And we've, in our...
It's too late in my life to explain this to me, but go ahead.
Okay. There's a continuum of directness to indirectness, which corresponds to the probability that your listener will interpret it as a veiled proposition. I mean, etchings has passed over the line to almost a synonym. But there are things like, do you want to come up and enjoy the view? Do you want to come up for coffee? Do you want to spend some more time together? Gee, it would be nice if we could spend some more time together. Gee, I'm sorry that the evening is ending so soon. And you could explore the different comfort zones where there's a region in which it's the other person, if they're willing, can interpret it as a proposition, and if they're unwilling, they can choose to ignore it, allowing both of you to maintain your assumption of being rational, sane human beings.
Saying any of those things would fill me with terror. I'm afraid I'm a hopeless case. But thanks for trying, Steve. I appreciate that. So, the part of your book, there's a part of your book, The Stuff of Thought, that you alluded to earlier that really gets into pretty heavy, I mean, I would say almost metaphysical territory, where you, it's very subtle. I mean, what I know of it, actually, I saw in your TED Talk, okay, mainly, on this, where basically you look at the way various words are used that are at first, there are some patterns in word usage and, the way certain verbs can be used one way and certain in another way that are at first puzzling. And you see a pattern in them that ultimately tells you something about what the truly fundamental categories of human cognition are, kind of. It winds up taking you back to these Kantian a priori categories like space and time and so on, right?
Exactly. In fact, that's how I got into it many years ago when I was just a word nerd and trying to figure out how verbs work in sentences. Why can you say I threw him the box, but not I carried him the box? The I carried him the box sounds a little odd, or I lifted him the box. Everyone knows what it means, but it just doesn't click as a natural sentence.
Right. You could say I carried the box to him or I threw the box to him, but then when you put it the way you did, you can only use one of them that way.
That's right. So that was the little grammatical puzzle that I began with. And to solve it, in that case, the difference is it depends on whether the action is protracted over time or whether it is instantaneous. So when you throw something, it's not literally instantaneous, but we think of it as, for all intents and purposes, instantaneous. Then the thing goes flying off, and that takes time. But the actual causation we think of as instantaneous.
Like handing him the box.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and carrying and lifting, though, the application of force, what I do to the box, is protracted over time. And that turns out to make the grammatical difference. And then looking at more and more cases like that, what is the subtle difference in meaning that we don't think about explicitly, but that nudges our intuitions one way or another? And it turns out that they are Kantian. They have to do with basic concepts like space and time and causation and intention, and that we, even though we don't realize it, we consult exactly those distinctions every time we pick a word to slot into a sentence. And so I argued that this was a way into the basic constituents of thinking, that is a window into that part of the mind. And it didn't have to end up that way. I could have imagined that you could imagine a language in which the grammatical distinctions hinge on evolutionarily salient scenarios like aggression, like food and eating, like disease resistance, like sexuality. You can imagine that the constructions of language would care whether your encounter with someone is sexual or non-sexual, or aggressive or not aggressive. But that turned out not to be the way that language works, that these basic ways of carving up reality that philosophers like Kant spoke about are the distinctions that matter when we choose which words to use.
Okay, and what does that tell you about the evolution of the mind? I mean, those fundamental categories that are taken into account naturally in language, are they things we were already consciously mulling over by the time before language had evolved fully, or I mean, what? What's the...
I think there is reason to believe that, in that experiments on other primates, like monkeys, suggest that they do have concepts like causation, like the difference between an object and a substance. It's harder to get their concepts of past, present, and future, and it's not clear that they have well-distinguished ones, so that may have appeared in the human lineage. But the more general answer to your question is that I think that these ideas are prior to language. I don't think that language, that we think in our native language, I don't think that English speakers think in English, and French speakers think in French, and so on. I think thought itself is composed of these more abstract categories, like spatial distinctions, objects, causation, instantaneous versus protracted events, and that is, those concepts are a kind of language of thought or mentalese.
So in that sense, there is a kind of a deep structure.
In a way, that's right. I mean, deep structure has a particular technical meaning within Chomskyan theory, but in the original formulation, it was the level of language that interfaced with thought. So it's close. Nowadays, I mean, I think linguists would probably call it conceptual structure or semantic structure. But you're right, in the original formulation, that's what would then be mapped onto deep structure when you had to put your thoughts into words. And then deep structure would be mapped onto surface structure.
And then what's interesting to me also is I think you argue that then when we go on to use language to construct ideas in realms like legal thought or philosophy or science, which is something we weren't doing during the evolution of language, what we often do is take these fundamental categories like space, time, force, and apply them metaphorically, right? To be able to talk about things we weren't kind of, in some sense, designed to talk about.
That's right. I think our folk science consists of using these categories directly, which is why our folk science is bad as real science. And we have to learn a new set of metaphors when we learn real science. Just to be concrete, a lot of experiments have shown that most people just really don't get Newtonian physics, even after they've taken a college physics course. They think that they subscribe intuitively to the medieval theory of the impetus, that an object is set into motion by applying some kind of oomph or impetus to it, which then gradually dissipates as the object rolls along, and when it's lost all of its impetus, then it stops moving. And our language allows us to talk about that very easily. Now, when you take college physics, the first thing you learn is that Newton's first law, an object that is not impinged on by a force maintains a constant velocity in a straight line. That is very unintuitive, and because it's the world that we evolved in is one in which the effects of force are masked by friction, giving an illusion that things have an impetus which then gets used up. And then learning science depends on taking some of our mental concepts and then remapping them or reapplying them to the natural world in new combinations. So, for example, we think of the stuff of life, of our bodily tissues and fluids, in molecular terms. That's what the lesson of molecular biology is. And so we have to apply our intuitive physics of how things are attracted to each other, fit into each other, impinge on each other. But now, instead of applying it to objects like rocks rolling across a field, we apply it to our stomachs and our brains and our muscles.
Right.
And whereas ordinarily, left to our own devices, we would use a kind of essentialism, that is, thinking that living things have some essence that gives them their form and that drives their bodily processes. When you take biology, it's forget about your essentialist thinking, start thinking in terms of little itty-bitty tinker toys. And a lot of education consists of applying these new metaphors to familiar domains.
And do you think, I mean, I've always assumed that one thing language was designed to take account of, to some extent, is human social interaction, right?
Absolutely.
And I've wondered if even so common a way of speaking, even by scientists, as to say A caused B, is in a way a carryover from a world in which, so-and-so, a discrete object, hits so-and-so, another discrete object, imparts force to that object. Whereas, it may be that actual reality is a little more kind of continuous, and what we normally think of as causality is rarely, if ever, the case of one discrete object causing another discrete object to do so. Do you see is the language of causality primitive, is what I'm asking?
Well, I think the concept of causality probably came first, because we do see it in monkeys, then the language of causality allowed us to share concepts of causality. And you're right. I mean, at the lowest level, a physicist would say that the universe is a bunch of differential equations, and that chopping it into causes and effects is putting kind of cuts that are salient to our eyeballs, but that aren't really there in reality. And more generally, often scientists can't pinpoint the cause of, say, a plane crash or a natural disaster.
Mm-hmm.
It's lots of stuff happens, and what unfolds, and picking out one thing as the instigator, which then, of course, we as humans like to attach a moral blame to, is something that doesn't always map onto the way that events unfold in the real world.
Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of things that are real, but that we're not designed to talk about, kind of. I mean...
Yeah, and that's, I think, what science often consists of, is to warp our own understanding so that it fits reality better.
Mm-hmm. And with quantum physics, we, I think, almost pass over a threshold into a whole new level of non-intuitive reality, right? I mean...
That's right. If the standard interpretation of quantum physics is right, then reality is deeply incompatible with our cognitive faculties. Although, to some extent, that's even true of classical Newtonian physics, which is deeply unintuitive.
Yeah.
But quantum physics even more so.
And in thinking about this, about your arguments here, I was reminded a little bit of Wittgenstein. That's a great phrase to drop at a cocktail party. I was reminded of Wittgenstein.
Works better than the etchings.
Yeah, much better. Yeah. And I know about the same about both etchings and Wittgenstein, which is almost nothing. I'm not sure anyone understood Wittgenstein. By the way, at the time, when the Tractatus, or however you pronounce it, was published, by Wittgenstein's own account, there was no one other than him who understood it. Bertrand Russell's endorsement is what got it published. Everyone else said, I don't get this. But Wittgenstein wrote a letter to Bertrand Russell explaining that Bertrand Russell didn't understand it. So, anyway, that's all an aside. Here's the part of... I am familiar with what I gather is the last line. Well, there's this line in the Tractatus, and maybe it's not the last line. He says... that his argument has been like a ladder that's designed to kind of get you to the top, and kind of, I think the spirit of it is, and to realize that there's something beyond the ladder. Okay? And this is, in other words, to realize that the argument itself is in some sense not all-encompassing and there's something beyond. Now, and this is related to his famous assertion that, that about which you know nothing, you should remain silent. You shouldn't speak about things you don't know anything about. That has been interpreted two ways. One was to mean that, that anyone who tries to say something in anything other than sheerly scientific language is talking gibberish. There is nothing else. Mm-hmm. And then there's the mystical interpretation, which I think we now think was Wittgenstein's own, which is that there is this whole reality out there that there's no point in talking about, but it's actually there, okay? Mm-hmm. Is any of this resonating at all, Steve, or am I starting?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I can't claim to understand what Wittgenstein meant either.
Yeah.
But here's what I mean, which is there will often be these clashes between the way reality is at the level of scientific understanding and our own intuitions. Quantum mechanics is perhaps the most famous example, but there may be ones that are closer to home for a psychologist or a brain scientist, such as why does first-person subjective experience emerge out of the physiology of the brain? Why do we have such a compelling impression that we have free will, that our actions are not caused? How can my words mean something when what they mean is not something that I've directly been acquainted with? Like if I talk about the first baby born in the year 2100, me and that baby, we now have a relationship, even though I'll be dead when he's born, or she, and there's no physical connection between us. But I am referring to her or him. That seems conceptually very weird. And so there's a set of philosophical problems that I think we can recognize as coming from a clash between the way things work and the way we're comfortable thinking about the way things work. where I would disagree, if I understand what Wittgenstein was saying, is that it doesn't mean that we have to be silent. We can always climb up one level higher. Maybe this is the latter, I don't know. But we can look down at our own cognitive limitations and say, well, this is never going to make intuitive sense to me. And I even know why it won't make intuitive sense to me. Namely, I've got a human brain which evolved to think in certain ways, and they may not mesh with all aspects of reality. But I can get at it obliquely through all of these other ways of knowing, not necessarily common sense, but mathematical equations, metaphors, experimental demonstrations,
right.
So that I still can, in some real sense, be said to know it and talk about it, even though it doesn't feel as natural to me as my everyday experience or even the parts of science that are much more intuitive.
Right. So quantum physics would be an example where we can do it mathematically. The math works, even though it seems to actually make sense in a certain way to no one.
That's right. I can't form a visual image of what's happening, but that's more a comment on my faculty of visual imagery than it is on the way the world works. And I can appreciate it in other ways than forming an image, namely understanding the equations.
So whereas Wittgenstein, as a kind of mystic, I think was saying that there's some territory that the limits of language and cognition prevent us from ever exploring or comprehending. I think you might be able to say he thought that. You're saying that nothing is off limits. It's just a question of whether how directly and intuitively we'll be able to kind of get it. I mean, there are tools of exploration such as metaphor and mathematics that make everything in principle in play.
Yes, that's right. I mean, we may never get over our befuddlement and dizziness over some of these questions when we try to grasp them intuitively, but we can factor that into our understanding and look down on ourselves as having a human brain that can only think in certain ways and say, well, yes, of course I'm befuddled. It's in the nature of the human brain to be befuddled by this kind of question.
I mean, I guess I was kind of, when I was thinking about these a priori concepts like space and time and force, I guess I was thinking, kind of going in the other direction almost, thinking, well, why should we think that those are the most fundamental, right? I mean, I don't know, never mind, I'm talking gibberish. But I can kind of, it's in thinking of it that way that I appreciate why Wittgenstein might say that this should instill a more kind of bracing humility even than the one you're recommending, I think. But anyway, and I assume actually Wittgenstein probably talked about Kant and dealt with all that. But again, he's the only person who seems to have understood what he was talking about. So what are you working on? I don't know to what extent you want to talk about your work in progress, but it's in a very different realm than what you've done in the past, right?
Yeah. I'm halfway through a book that is going to expand an article and a talk that I've already done on the historical decline of violence and its psychological roots. That is why, I mean, contrary to most people's impression, in many ways we've been getting less violent. Homicides are much lower in modern Western societies than they were several hundred years ago. A lot of barbaric practices like sadistic forms of capital punishment, slavery, mutilation as a form of criminal punishment, beating of children, all of them these customs have died away in the West and to some extent in other parts of the world. Even if you look at a more recent time slice of the last 60 years, war between nation-states is way down. Deaths from war has gone way down. The question that I ask is why are we the beneficiaries of these developments, given that human nature probably has not changed, certainly has not changed in the last 60 years.
Is the trend itself not controversial? Are the data clear now?
I think that the data, not in all cases, because they were at the mercy of what people recorded in past decades and centuries. So there's no graph that you can plot on genocides over time, up to the last 50 or 60 years. though there are graphs that you can plot on things like homicide and war. But in cases where we do have the data, and depending on what time scale you look at, I think it's pretty clear. And the book will consist of a lot of graphs documenting these changes before attempting to explain them.
Okay, so one can confidently assert that over some period of time, deaths by violence as a percentage of the world's population has declined.
That's right.
And over what period of time can we say that?
Depending on the kind of deaths you're talking about, because the processes are very different for, say, one-on-one homicide compared to state-sponsored violence, compared to wars between states. So these, I've divided them as much for convenience as anything else into what I call the first civilizing process, which is the transition from anarchy to government, more or less, from the shockingly high rates of violence in hunter-gatherer and hunter-horticultural societies to the first states, which brings down the homicide rate by about a factor of 10. The second civilizing process, which differentiated the Middle Ages to the present, where there's another decline of almost a factor of 10 in places where we have continuous data, like England and other parts of Europe. I talk about the first humanitarian revolution, which is where one of the reasons that homicide went down with the advent of government is that government prevented people from engaging in constant raiding and feuding. On the other hand, we did trade one kind of violence for another, namely violence by the government against its citizens.
Right.
That started to get chipped away at during the Enlightenment with innovations like democracy and judicial reform, not breaking people on the wheel and burning them at the stake, and allowing one person to enslave another. And then the fourth historical development that I use is what I call the second humanitarian revolution, which is basically the recognition of universal human rights in the ashes of World War II, and the continuing process of expanding human rights. Obviously, an ongoing process. Lots of work needs still to be done.
And so, do you want to talk at all about the theories you're entertaining, or the explanations you're entertaining for this, or is that the part that's in progress?
Well, it is in progress, but I've gone on record in my article in the New Republic and my TED Talk, so it's not exactly a secret. But I think that one of the main processes is the one that Hobbes identified in Leviathan, namely, if you do have a third party to adjudicate your disputes, then that breaks the vicious cycle of vendetta and feuding that makes the body counts pile up in traditional societies. So having the rule of law and a judicial system is, in general, a good thing. The second process is related to the one that you wrote about in Nonzero, namely if there are greater opportunities for mutually beneficial exchanges and cooperation, positive-sum games. That changes the incentive structure so that your neighbors are more valuable alive than dead, and you have a selfish interest in cooperating with them rather than conquering and plundering them. And it's related to the Leviathan theory in that it's often the institutions of a state that grease the wheels for cooperation within the state. Financial institutions, ways of enforcing contracts, and so the two tend to develop often together. And this was a major argument from the sociologist Norbert Elias, a German sociologist who, even before these data were available, tried to explain the move away from one-on-one violence in Europe between the Middle Ages and the present. Then I think a third process is a kind of a universalist cosmopolitan sensibility that allows us to imagine ourselves in other people's shoes and puts something of a brake on the tendency to dehumanize and demonize people who are unlike yourself.
Right.
Which I suspect was an indirect product of advances in literacy and printing and reading and transportation. When you start hearing about what happens to other people, their civilizations rise and then they fall, they have pleasures and pains like you do,
right?
Then it's harder to treat the people on the other side of the river as snakes and bugs and cockroaches, and I think that's also a humanizing force.
Right. Now I would see that as related to the non-zero sum issue, in the sense that I would assume that this machinery, this ability we have to put ourselves project ourselves into the kind of mind of someone and try to see things the way they see them and appreciate even their suffering. I would assume that that's machinery that natural selection built to help us navigate a landscape of non-zero sum and zero sum relationships, and that we naturally employ it with people who are in some sense in a non-zero sum relationship, whether relatives, where the non-zero sum relationship is in a sense at the genetic level, or kind of allies and friends, right? And that, I mean, first of all, does that make sense to you that what I call moral imagination? Well, I would only call it moral imagination if you're extending it beyond where it's easy to extend it, I guess. But this ability of projection, would you agree that that is itself natural and kind of an adaptation? And the question is where and how you deploy it?
Yes, and in fact, I think that argument was made very nicely by Peter Singer in his book, The Expanding Circle, where what natural selection may have given us is this capacity to get inside other people's heads, what psychologists call theory of mind, which is related to sympathy or empathy, but that by default we apply it to a pretty narrow circle of friends and kin. But there is elasticity built in at the margins, and that what the humanitarian revolutions consist of is putting pressure on us to expand that circle and to embrace larger and larger fractions of humanity into that moral circle.
And the question is, to what extent is our expanding it dependent on our perceiving ourselves to have a non-zero sum relationship with them, and to what extent can kind of pure reason start carrying the moral imagination and making it universal? That's Peter Singer's argument, the latter. And an interesting test case is to what extent his cause prevails and we start expanding it even to animals and empathize with their suffering, because you can't argue, well, in any conventional way, that the main dynamic would be non-zero sum, right? I mean...
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. And I mean, part of it I think one of the contributors historically could be these positive sum games, but another could be ways of tugging at our empathy by seeing facial expressions or cries of pain of other people or other animals, and by the purely intellectual stance that you can't defend the proposition that your own interests ought to be privileged over those of another sentient being. So all of these could push in the same direction, and the fact that it isn't a single process is also compatible with the fact that this progress is so jerky and uneven. It hasn't been kind of a steady advance, nor is it anywhere near universal.
Yeah.
As Singer would argue, the way we treat animals and the way we treat people in the developing world show that we still have a ways to go.
Yeah, well, that sounds like a good book, and I think you can count on there being enough entrenched resistance to the very idea that there's been progress as to generate a certain amount of publicity for it.
Yes. Well, in fact, I've done a survey where I've just asked a sample of several hundred people, do you think that there was more violence, say, in the 14th century in England or the 20th century? Do you think there was more violence in the 1970s or in this decade? And in every case, people assume that the present is more violent than the past. And in every one of the cases that I asked about, the data show that it's the other way around. Right.
And in particular, compared to the first half of the 20th century, the second half was not wonderful, but an improvement, I think.
It was absolutely an improvement. There's just no question. Even though there were, it wasn't a steady decline. It's a kind of an inclined sawtooth with bumps for the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Iran-Iraq War.
Well, yeah, and in other realms, the Cambodian genocide and Rwanda.
Right,
in that other category.
Genocides. But genocides have gone down as well, at least over the last 20 years or so.
Okay, well, I want to kind of close by exploring this interesting idea you had. It's related to these non-zero-sum games about kind of moral realism, which I guess we can define in an only slightly misleading way as saying the view that, moral truths are in some sense kind of out there, in quotes, right? As opposed to just these things that we make up. If you'll settle for that definition, I'll let you explain what your argument is, or you can amend that definition.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that certainly captures the idea. I'm not sure if I'm a moral realist, because I guess I'm not sure exactly what philosophers mean by it.
Yeah.
But there are some things that are in the nature of reality that are relevant to what we call moral. That they're not arbitrary rules like whether you wear fat neckties or skinny neckties. And one of them is the game theoretic matrix of the prisoner's dilemma and similar conundra, where you really are better off. Two agents really are better off if both of them decide not to commit aggression to the other.
Right.
Compared to if they both did, if one of them exploited the other, he'd be better off, the other guy would be worse. Mm-hmm. But since that's symmetrical, you really want to, if you know it's good for you, you really do want to aim for the cell in the matrix in which neither of you commits aggression on the other.
Right.
Now, what I just described, that's not a bit of our psychology, and it's not a law of physics. It's basically a mathematical truth that there exist situations that have that structure. Mm-hmm. If you combine the benefits of cooperation with the Darwinian mechanism that says we like things that benefit us, then you get at least a kind of pressure toward cooperation mm-hmm. and away from violence, to the extent that people are in these situations where cooperation is better than exploitation, and to the extent that we can muddle our way to that part of the space of logical possibilities. And there's a second aspect of the nature of reality that militates towards morality, which is that whenever you have two agents that are engaged in discourse, that are exchanging ideas and persuading one another, one can't maintain that one's own interests deserve to be privileged simply because they are one's own interests.
Right.
That is, I can't say that my pleasure is more valuable than yours and my pain is worse than yours.
Even though by nature you act on the assumption that it is, right? That's the interesting thing, is that the necessity of entering into these relationships forces us to abandon, at least ostensibly, an assumption that has totally guided, evolution yes. and our lives up into that point.
That's right, which is why in a state of nature, if I can use that phrase, people aren't particularly nice to each other. That you have this feuding and warfare
right.
and exploitation. But once you get onto the track of discussing how you should live your life and persuading others of how they should treat you, it forces you almost logically to treat them in kind, mm-hmm. simply because you can no more privilege your own interests than you can privilege, say, the particular spot you happen to be standing on just because you happen to be standing on it.
Right.
The very process of engaging in intellectual discourse is one that has to dissolve the ego by the very fact that the whole point of talking, arguing, discussing is coming to conclusions that are acceptable to the two of you.
Right.
Once you play that game, then the rules, which are in some sense out there, say that appealing to your own interests because they're your own is not a move that you can make. It cannot be defended on rational grounds. So that's another sense in which there is something in the very nature of logical argumentation that militates towards what we would call moral. And it's not a coincidence that most of the world's enduring moral systems capture that idea in some form or another.
Right.
The golden rule, the categorical imperative, the veil of ignorance, all of them involve subtracting one's own egocentric position from the debate and looking at things from the viewpoint of eternity, as Spinoza put it.
Right, and we should emphasize maybe that this dynamic, we've been talking about it in the context of people kind of conversing about moral systems and developing moral systems. The dynamic itself, kind of kicks in earlier in the sense that, that is to say, natural selection recognizes the self-serving nature of entering into non-zero-sum games and playing them wisely, and instills, even in chimpanzees, some sort of rudimentary intuitions that help them form alliances and friendships. And in our species, that seems to be responsible for, arguably, for some intuitions such as the idea that good deeds just kind of should be rewarded and bad deeds kind of should be punished. I mean, I kind of think those intuitions prevail in hunter-gatherer societies the world around. That's not the same as the golden rule quite, but it gets you, those kinds of intuitions are a head start. They move you in the direction of the golden rule, but I think if you accept what I've said so far, you would say that there too, where we're talking about biological evolution and not really about the cultural evolution of discourse, it's the same truths out there that are, in a sense, guiding the process, right?
Yeah, that is, one way that vocabulary that might feel more comfortable to an evolutionary biologist is that it's the shape of the adaptive landscape.
Right.
Which is not something that organisms create. It's something that reality creates that organisms then navigate as they evolve.
Right. Or you could almost say that just as kind of nutritional substances that are out there in the environment encourage the evolution of more sophisticated means of exploiting them, the existence of non-zero-sumness as a kind of abstract stuff, to be harvested, encourages the evolution of the machinery for exploiting that ability, kind of.
Yeah, if you're in a part of the space where you can evolve the neural circuitry that allows you to exploit it.
You have to make you have to make assumptions about the nature of the social system. But as far as the nature of the social system, they're pretty generic. And then on top of that, you're right. You have to get to a point in terms of your information processing system where you can kind of do the work.
That's right. And you also have to live in the kind of ecological circumstances that means that the positive sum benefits are there to be had. There may be cases in nature where you really are in zero-sum competition. And if that's the part of the space that you find yourself in, then there may not be a way to climb out of it into the positive sum region.
Right. You can be kind of stuck in this space where the logic doesn't work. Although these computer simulations pioneered by Robert Axelrod and so on tend to show that the logic of cooperation doesn't have to get that huge a foothold in a population before it becomes the strategy that you want to gravitate toward.
Yes, right.
So I gotta ask, did you feel misused and abused when I used this idea of yours in this New York Times op-ed where I said it was about it was an argument that a certain type of religion is compatible with science? I mean, I was kind of largely talking about a deistic kind of, to the extent that there was a kind of God implicit or maybe even explicit, I don't remember. It was a kind of deistic God that would build the system and set it in motion. But anyway, I was saying, if you were looking, if you wanted to mount the case that was true, if your hypothesis was that there was morally directional purpose built into the system, in other words, the kind of purpose we would associate with gods as we thought of them, this idea that maybe these particular kinds of moral truths are, in a sense, out there, kind of attracting the evolutionary system toward them, is something that you could logically, invoke on your side of the argument.
So, as an if-then statement, I think I agree. Although I would not sign on to the premise that this is an important or a good or a reasonable thing to do. But if one were to do it...
That what is not? You mean to make arguments to make conjectural arguments about deistic gods, or...
Yeah, I mean, that is... I think it should be an open question whether there's any reason to do that, rather than accepting it as a premise. Yes, we should do it now. Let's figure out how.
Right.
The prior question is there any reason to do that? So that's, I think, where I would disagree with you. If one, for whatever reason, decided that this was an important thing to do, then I suppose one avenue that's not unreasonable is the one that you've explored.
Yeah.
Namely, the fact that there is something about reality that makes what we would otherwise call morality better than its alternative, and something that any goal-seeking organism might pursue. You could explore it along those lines, although for me it's academic, because I think the prior question is the important one, namely, is there any reason to look for reasons to support a deism in the first place?
Yeah, well, and those just might be idiosyncratic psychological reasons. In other words, some people are interested in the question and would find consolation in certain kinds of answers. I mean, I imagined that if the question was pursued, it would be in places like seminaries more than, I don't think you have to worry about me recommending that you put it into your psychology curriculum or anything.
Right.
Okay, I was curious. Because usually the objections to what I was doing there start earlier than where you're started, so I feel I fared fairly well. Well, we've been at this an hour. Anything else that you're working on that you want to talk about, or?
Well, I'll mention something completely different just because I found it very exciting and has nothing to do with anything we've talked about. But with my collaborators Ned Sahin and Eric Hallgren, we recently published a paper in Science on language in the brain using an unconventional technique. Namely, we collaborate with neurosurgeons who work with epileptic patients, where they literally impale the brain with these knitting needle-like electrodes in order to identify the source of an epileptic seizure so that they can then surgically extirpate it. But while the patient is waiting for the seizure to happen, they've got these electrodes in their brain, something that you ordinarily can't do with humans. You can do with monkeys. Well, Peter Singer would say that maybe you shouldn't, but we do. But we certainly don't do it with humans unless, by sheer coincidence, there's this surgical procedure that calls for it. And that allowed us to record brain activity while people were reading and saying words and grammatically manipulating them, like turning a noun into the plural or a verb into the past tense. And so we were able to plot out a sequence of events in the brain that correspond to the linguistic processes of looking up a word, manipulating it grammatically, preparing it for pronunciation. So anyway, that's something completely different that I found very gratifying. So
did you say you published on that, or you're going to publish?
Yeah, it just came out in Science 2 weeks ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll link to what will probably only be an abstract, or maybe it got some coverage somewhere and we could link to a summary of it.
Terrific.
Okay, well, that sounds good. And I guess, in principle, you could apply that to a lot of studies, or is it by nature, is that by virtue of where they intervene for these surgical purposes, you're kind of confined to more cognitive, say, and less emotional stuff? And
it's a really good question, and we were lucky that these patients had the electrodes implanted in language areas of the brain, and it is often true that epilepsy begins in the temporal lobe, and some of those language areas are in temporal lobe, but ours were in the frontal lobe. I think in principle, actually, depending on where epileptic foci are distributed in the brain, it could be almost anything that could be tapped. The methodological limitation is that you want some discrete bang-on event to trigger the recording. So you can't just have a person muse about moral or religious thoughts.
Right.
There has to be one word or one picture that starts the clock, and then you look at the waveform from when the clock starts. But I imagine, though, that could be done by an ingenious enough experimenter, and so you could, in theory, look at the neural basis of a moral reaction, for example.
Well, you can talk to, I guess, bring that to the attention of Josh Green, who I think is at Harvard now, right?
He's just upstairs from me now.
I'm sure he'll be on the case in
Yes.
no time. And tell him I said hi. Well, thanks a lot, Steve. I really appreciate it. This has been fascinating.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot, Bob, for having me on.
Okay, take care.
Okay, you too.